And we are live.
All right, Emily, should I go ahead and get started?
You are good to go, Chris.
All right, thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started introducing everything as more people roll into the webinar. My name is Chris Tavener, and I serve as staff attorney for the Ohio Environmental Council. For more than 50 years, the OEC has worked to implement forward-thinking, science-based, pragmatic solutions to secure healthy air, land, and water for all who call Ohio home. Today, we're excited to work with All on the Line and the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund for an in-depth exploration of Ohio's redistricting process, its history, and the opportunities for fair maps in 2021 here in Ohio. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature and use the chat. But without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. First up, we have Justin Quasa, Voting Rights Program Director at the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. Justin will be providing an overview of the national redistricting landscape. He will be followed by Katie Shanahan, State Director for All on the Line, Ohio. She will dive deep into Ohio's redistricting process and its history. After their presentations, Kalia Tellez, Environmental Policy Fellow for OEC, and myself will conduct a tutorial of the redistricting tool District R. We'll be showcasing its ability to help inform the redistricting process and how Ohioans and people in other states can use it too, if you happen to be in another state. But once again, please feel free to ask questions throughout using the Q&A feature and to join the conversation in the chat. As Justin gets ready to give his presentation, we will launch the first poll question to see where everyone is coming from across Ohio. Important for those of you who are here for CLE credit, make sure you're taking the poll questions throughout the webinar, and there is a survey at the end as required by the Supreme Court. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that first poll question. Let's see. All right, there should be a poll now for you all to vote on. And then Justin, you can go ahead and I think start sharing your screen with your slides. Give the poll about 10 more seconds, and then I'll share the results so we can see where everyone's coming from. All right. So pretty decent spread throughout Ohio, though unfortunately no one from Southeast Ohio. Yeah, with that, I'll pass it along for Justin. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, my name is Justin Quasa. I'm the Voting Rights Program Director at League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, and really excited to be with you. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., but even though I'm not from Ohio, I did try to wear my best Buckeye red. I know it's not the exact colors, but you know, I'm trying. Just work with me, please. Really excited to have this conversation, just because obviously redistricting is something that's huge across the country, and it's really going to show how we do politics in our country, both on the local, state, and federal level for the next 10 years. So really excited to be a part of this conversation. And want to start off with a question I usually get, being a representative from the League of Conservation Voters, which is, why are we interested in redistricting? Why is an environmental group interested in doing any of this work when, you know, we should be focused on the environment? And what we like to say is that a healthy democracy is directly connected to a healthy environment. You know, while democracy doesn't have direct environmental connections, when we look at democracy and where it fails people, the environment has some of the best stories that makes that connection. We know that everybody wants healthy land. We know that everybody wants clean air and clean water. Yet we live in a system where that doesn't always happen, because people can buy their way or influence their ways in certain ways in order to make sure that doesn't happen. And so what we need to do as environmental organizations is really start playing chess and use all the tools in our toolkit in order to make sure that we can create a system that creates the most healthy environment and the most protected environment that we can. And that's why we care about democracy. That's why we care about voting. And that's why we especially care about redistricting, which has a huge effect on the game of politics that is played that ultimately leads to positive and good environmental policy. So in addition to everything that I said, we also really care about redistricting because the communities that are most susceptible to environmental injustice are also the ones that we know are most likely to be discriminated at the polling places and will be drawn out of districts and drawn out of representation during this redistricting process. So we need to make those connections and make sure that these communities are represented in our local, state, and national seats of power. And we're going to go into this a little bit later, but there are any number of ways that people can draw out or disenfranchise communities based off of how they draw the maps and what specifically people care about drawing the maps in a way where that voice isn't fully represented in our democracy. So that's why an environmental group is here in the democracy space and talking about redistricting, is because we need to make sure we have as equitable of a democracy as possible. Because when we know that happens, we know that people will always vote for proper environmental policy and to protect their environment and their communities. So with that being said, we can't have any conversation about redistricting without first talking about the 2020 census. And the 2020 census, as you know, happened last year. And just a couple of things that we want to know that will actually come that will come back around a little later in the conversation. Number one, we know that throughout the country in the past 10 years, the country is moving away from the East Coast and Midwest, which is unfortunate, and moving to the South and West. And so when you look at the states that gain seats, they're mostly on the West Coast and in the South, like North Carolina, Colorado, Florida, and Texas, which actually got 2 seats. And then we look at the states that lost a congressional seat, they do fall mostly in the Midwest, including, unfortunately, Ohio. But within those trends, here's what we're seeing. We're seeing that non-white communities are growing at a faster rate than the national average, as well as for white communities. And that's really significant because, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the way maps are drawn, we can either strengthen or take away the voice of those communities and the voice of those communities, depending on how we redraw these maps. And so that's going to be extremely important in order that we have the most equitable maps so that we can represent this change in demographics so we can really get the environmental policy that we know that we need for now and also for the future. And then finally, we know right now I'm speaking to you from a C3 standpoint, but it's not C3 it's totally plausible from a C3 standpoint to say that redistricting is going to have a significant effect of who controls the House after this midterm election. Right now, as I showed, as you see at the bottom, is a very narrow separation between Democrats and Republicans. And the way that the maps are drawn in a couple of states can make that difference. Obviously, people going out to vote is the most significant factor of that, but also redistricting plays a significant factor in that as well. So let's talk about the timeline. So one of the things I want to get through to you today, as we go into like what you can do in Ohio, is to say that nationally, there have been a lot of attempts to adjust how the data for redistricting has been collected in order to disenfranchise a lot of communities that we're talking about right now. It all starts way back in March of 2018 when the Trump administration specifically added a citizenship question to the census. And so that was obviously used to scare and to deter a lot of communities, particularly in the Latinx and immigrant communities, from participating in the census. And we know that a census is so important in order to account every single person that lives in the country so that we can respond properly and that we can represent properly all the communities that make up our country. Fortunately, the Supreme Court struck it down, and so that crisis averted there. So then in January of 2020, census collection began. We started in Alaska. Everything seemed to go great. We were going to have a really great census. And then something happened during the spring that kind of threw everything for a loop. I don't know if you guys remember it, but that happened. So that threw a lot in. Number one, obviously, the door-to-door collection of census data was thrown out of whack. And once again, that mostly affects the Black and brown communities that we talked about earlier that are affected both on the environmental side as well as the democracy side most substantially. And so eventually, the collection deadline was pushed back to August 3rd. And so we were able to, with that additional timeline, try to make up as much as we can and get an accurate count as possible. And so now we're here in 2021, where in April, the Census Bureau released the population count and the quality metrics. That is our first look into what redistricting is going to look like. And that's where we got the numbers that I mentioned earlier about where states, we know which states will, at least on the federal level, will receive more seats or less seats in Congress. So with that being said, I just want to give you a quick idea of like where everybody in the country stands and how redistricting is done in each of the states. So we talked about earlier where Ohio is in a situation where the legislature is responsible for it with governor approval. And for most of the country, that is how it actually happens. But one of the important things I want folks to know is that there also are additional processes that that states get to their redistricting. I also want to notice too that this is for federal redistricting, and there can be a difference between federal redistricting and how you assign people to Congress, and then how people are assigned in your state legislature as well as in your local thing. So this is only for federal redistricting, and we'll go into the state a little bit later. But the biggest thing I want you to know is that across the country, one of the biggest trends is to have independent commissions that are made up of folks that are not politicians coming together to make maps in order to attempt to be as fair as possible. Obviously, no system is perfect, but the idea that legislatures are able to determine where the lines are doesn't sit right well with a lot of democracy champions. And so just wanted to highlight that a lot of states, as you see once again out west, it seems to be most popular, but are trying to go with the trend of going to independent risk commissions rather than have politicians do there. And these are conversations that are going to be happening for the next 10 years about who has the right and who should be making these maps. So coming to this summer, now that we have the now that we know kind of, at least on the federal level, how the seats are going to be distributed, right now what's happening across the country is we're advocating for redistricting protections that are located in two pieces of legislation in particular, which is the For the People Act, which is S1, and then also the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is HR4. And so I want to very quickly kind of go through what's in there in both of those. So number one, for the For the People Act, which is right now sitting in Congress and waiting for a vote, or sorry, has recently been voted on, but has been filibustered. And so we're waiting on the next action after the filibuster. Ultimately, what the For the People Act is trying to do is try to make every single state, at least for their federal redistricting requirements, be done by independent redistricting committees, as well as put in national guidelines in order to make sure that whatever map comes out of all these states aren't racially discriminatory and don't, lessen the voice of any community. So I know this is a lot right here, but I can also, like in the chat once we're done, drop a link for the Brennan Center, who has like a full markup and a full annotated version of what the specific redistricting provisions are. But just want to also let you know that in this act that is mostly about voting rights, there is a redistricting portion in there that is really important. And also champions are trying to pass this by August so that these laws can be in place in time for redistricting in all the states across the country. The only other thing I want to do is also really quickly talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 2019 in the previous Congress, but once again got dropped off in the Senate. And ultimately what it does is restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but which is very important for voting rights issues. But what happened was actually 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court actually made another decision that affected Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which does jeopardize the fair redistricting process, as this is the main act that people use if maps are not drawn fairly or if maps are discriminatory. This is the main law that they use in order to fight back against it. So right now, what's happening across the country is that there are being field hearings taking place in order to figure out how do we adjust this act in order to deal with modern day suppression and not suppression that we saw in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So just also want to know that on the national level in DC, that's really what we're fighting for in order to affect the redistricting process in states like Ohio. So the final thing that I wanted to highlight before I pass it on and we really get Ohio specific is next month in August, we are expecting the redistricting data to be released. This is something that was expected to be released back in April, but once again, because of COVID, because of all the delays, it has been pushed back until August. And from there, it is a sprint to the finish to go from August all the way till the end of this year, because not redistricting, but midterms are coming, and we need to make sure that everybody knows what piece of turf they're running for and running on. And so it is going to be it is going to be an intense process. And so really, starting in September, we need you to get to work. And so that's why we're so happy that all of you are here in order to talk about how you can best affect this system. So with that, that's all I have to say. I really appreciate you, Chris, and OEC for inviting me, and really looking forward to the discussion and figuring out how we can draw the best and most equitable maps in Ohio. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Justin. That was a great overview of what's going on at the national level. I'll remind everyone, if you have any immediate questions right now to ask Justin, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section and he can answer them live right in this moment. If you've got a question that you just want to wait and hold on to, put it in the chat while Katie is talking, or in the later sections. Justin can answer as well, or Justin could answer it after Katie's section if it's a question that we think should be raised for the entire group to hear. But please ask those questions if you have them. And yeah, Justin just posted in the chat the link to the Brennan Center resource that has the annotated overview of the act that he was going over. So before Katie starts, I'm going to run our next poll while Katie gets her presentation up. So let's go with, when it comes to fair maps, what do you think is the most important? And I think Katie might end up talking about some of these things during her presentation, but let's see what people think.
Hey, Chris, just wanted to cue, there's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, great. So while we're doing the poll, yes, that's a good question. Justin, what are quality metrics?
Yeah, absolutely. So that actually didn't have anything to do with the redistricting part, but quality metrics are essentially are releasing kind of the full breadth of the metrics that were included, just so that statisticians can look at the metrics and make sure that it is actually statistically representative of the population. So it's just a very transparent measure that the census is doing for the first time this year, allowing statisticians in order to look at the as full of the data as possible, obviously not including personal information, but allowing them to look at the data in order to independently verify that the census is a statistically significant and respectable survey of the American people.
Yeah, I think I was kind of wondering what quality metrics were. I kind of had a guess. I'm glad you explained that and that someone asked that question. So we'll give the poll just a few more seconds. But yeah, we got a nice mix of what people think is the most important thing. And Katie, I'll kick it over to you to give an overview of what some of these things are, plus a whole lot more. So are you good to share your screen?
I am indeed. Let me get it up on the screen for everybody. First, thanks to you, Chris, and the folks at OEC for the invitation to be here. Really excited always to talk about redistricting and our path to fair maps. Like Chris said at the top, my name's Katie Shanahan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Ohio State Director with All on the Line. We are a grassroots advocacy campaign that's part of a national effort to end gerrymandering and to restore fairness to our redistricting process. And the Ohio redistricting process is a really unique opportunity because it is entirely new. We completely overhauled how we will go through the redistricting process in 2015 and in 2018 when Ohioans overwhelmingly supported two different redistricting reform measures that not only changed who draws our maps, but also how they have to draw our maps. So I'm going to go over how that redistricting process will actually work. But before that, I just want to do a little bit of a level setting conversation to talk about what the last decade has looked like for Ohio living under some of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. The reality is that for the last 10 years, Ohioans have been effectively denied any real form of adequate political representation, both at the congressional level and the state legislative level, because our district lines just do not adequately reflect how we actually vote. Ohio is a purple state. I will die on that hill. We are not a red state. You can see the pie charts here. Across the decade, we split almost 50-50 down the middle, with Republicans just edging out Democrats 55-45, and yet that is not what we see reflected in the seats of the delegation that we send to DC, to Congress, or certainly in our state house. So even though across the decade, across the entire lifespan of our current maps, even though Republicans won just 55% of the statewide vote share in congressional races, they walk away with a whopping 75% of our seats. And that is a proportion of seats that has been unchanged for the entire decade. Republicans have gotten 12 of our 16 seats for the last 10 years, even though they have won nowhere near 75% of the vote. You see that same sort of discrepancy in our state legislative races. So again, even though Republicans are just picking up 55% of the vote, they enjoy supermajorities in both chambers in the state house. They occupy about 65% of the seats. And the reason that you have this discrepancy is solely because of our gerrymandered districts, that you have such a difference between how Ohioans are actually voting and who occupies those seats is something that we are trying to fix during this redistricting cycle in 2021, and it's our once in a decade opportunity to do so. But what is it actually meant to live under those districts? It means that we have not been able to make any progress on any number of issues that Ohioans care about or address the needs that our communities have, because our legislators are not actually accountable to us as their voters, because we essentially don't elect them. Our gerrymandered district lines elect them. In 2011, during the redistricting process, certain politicians cheated to gerrymander those lines, to manipulate them to favor one political party over the other. And that means, especially in the realm of the climate and the environment, that we are not able to make progress on things that actually reflect how Ohioans feel. So maybe this is wild to hear, but Ohioans overwhelmingly support acting on climate, investing in renewable energy. You would never be able to guess that based on all of the terrible bills that are churned out of the Ohio State House, especially the one that Governor DeWine just signed into law the other day, which would make it even more difficult for localities to install wind farms. This is something that we shouldn't be debating at this point, and we wouldn't be if it weren't for our gerrymandered districts. So when we say that it is all on the line in our fight for fair maps, we literally mean it. We will not be able to make progress on any major issue at the state or federal level if we do not fix our maps. And I could not possibly underscore enough the urgency of now and the importance of this process, particularly in the realm of fighting the harmful impacts of climate change, which we are seeing every single day, and especially among those communities, like Justin was saying, the communities who are bearing the brunt of climate change are the exact same marginalized communities whose voices are diluted by our gerrymandered districts, who are suppressed at the ballot box. That is not a coincidence. So fixing this issue is so crucial. Okay, I'm gonna start to go over this redistricting process. It is a bit of a doozy. There are two different processes that we use to draw our maps. One is for the state legislative maps, the other is for our congressional maps. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. I will try to keep an eye on those as I'm going through these so that folks can get them answered as we're going through. I'm seeing one in the chat box. Don't rural communities also have more representation than urban areas? Eleanor, that's a great question. The answer is effectively yes. Just because of how our districts are drawn, we essentially give an outsized voice to communities that are not actually representative of the entirety of the state. And so because of how we draw our districts, our map drawers were very good at packing Democrats into as few districts as possible, and then maximizing the Republican districts to sort of eat up all of those other areas. And so you're giving a lot more weight to communities in Ohio and opinions in Ohio that are not reflective of the electorate as a whole. So definitely trying to balance the scales there with fair maps. Okay, so when we're talking about the redistricting process, first we have to talk about who actually runs the map drawing process. There are three main entities to keep in mind. Two of them are who actually draws our maps, and then one of them is who actually judges our maps once they're drawn. So the first entity is a new 7-member redistricting commission. This is replacing what used to be called the apportionment board. And the commission is in charge of drawing our state legislative maps. We'll talk about who's on there in just a second. The second entity to keep in mind is our state legislature. The General Assembly is mostly who's in charge of drawing our congressional maps, although the commission does actually play a role. So Ohio is actually a hybrid state. It's not just the legislature who draws our congressional maps. The redistricting commission does also play a part if necessary. The third entity to keep in mind is the Ohio Supreme Court. Our reform measures in 2015 and in 2018 are now a part of the Ohio Constitution, and the constitutional language provides the Supreme Court what's called original jurisdiction, which for all of the non-lawyers on the call means that they are the first court who gets to review any potential challenge relevant to the redistricting process. So it doesn't matter if you are challenging the process itself, the maps themselves, if it is a partisan gerrymandering challenge, if it's a racial gerrymandering challenge, if it's any other type of constitutional challenge, you first go to the Ohio Supreme Court. Whether you can go anywhere else, so if you can appeal it to any other court, especially into federal court, is entirely dependent on what type of challenge you are bringing. So I think Justin mentioned that the US Supreme Court issued an opinion a few years ago that closed the federal courthouse doors to partisan gerrymandering challenges. So if you want to challenge a map that you think favors one political party over the other, you can no longer go into federal court to do that. You have to stay in state court. If, however, you are challenging the map because you think it is racially gerrymandered, so you think that race was a predominant factor in how districts were drawn, or if it is a federal constitutional claim, or if HR 1 ever passed, if you wanted to do an HR 1 related claim, you could still go into federal court, but you would first have to go to the Ohio Supreme Court. So these are the three main actors to keep in mind. And the reason especially the first two are important is that's who all of your advocacy targets are. So during the process itself, those are the people who are going to be nagging to actually host a fair process. Good question from Fran. I'm actually going to hold this question, Fran, until a little later. She has a question about whether funding has been released to the committees to actually start the process. I'll talk about that at the end of this section, but I will get there. Okay, so the first process that occurs is drawing our state legislative district. So this is our Ohio House and Ohio Senate seats. Like I said, there's a new 7-member commission who's in charge of that. The 7 members of that commission are the Ohio governor, the Secretary of State, and the auditor, and then 4 legislative nominees, 1 each from each of the legislative leaders. So the Speaker of the House, Senate President, and then the minority leaders from both caucuses will each nominate 1 person to serve on those on that commission. We don't know yet who any of those nominees are because Governor DeWine has not yet convened this commission. So I will go on a little tangent here that we are a month and 3 days away from getting our redistricting data, and we still don't know who's drawing our map because Governor DeWine has not yet convened this district. So if you feel like giving him a buzz to tell him to get to work, I wouldn't be mad at that. So in this process, there are three main steps to get our maps. There are two options to get a map that will last the entire decade, 10 years until the next time we do the census in 2030. And there's one option where we get a 4-year map. In order to get a 10-year map, there has to be some level of bipartisan support. And then the 4-year map is if they can't get bipartisan support, the Republicans can just push through a 4-year map. So let's talk about what those steps are. Step number one, by September 1st of 2021, in order to get a 10-year map, the commission has to vote in favor with just a simple majority, so 4 of those 7 members, including at least 2 Republicans and both of the Democratic members. The reason for this is that of those 7 members, 5 of them are Republicans, only 2 are Democrats. The Constitution requires at least 2 members of each party to vote in favor of the map. Since there's only 2 Dems, it means you have to get both of them to vote in favor of the map for it to last for the entire 10 years. There are also requirements at every step of the process to host a certain number of public hearings after maps have been publicly proposed, but before they get voted on. And I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. But again, they've got to get bipartisan support. If they can get both of the Democrats and at least 2 Republicans to vote in favor of the state legislative maps by September 1st, then we're good to go. We have a 10-year map. If they can't do that, so maybe they can't get that bipartisan agreement, maybe they can't get the deal done in time, we go to step 2, and there's a one-time 2-week extension until September 15th to try again, to get a 10-year bipartisan map. Again, they've got to get both Democrats, at least 2 Republicans to sign on. They've got to host another hearing. If they can do all that by September 15th, then we're done in step 2 and we've got a 10-year map. If they cannot get that bipartisan agreement, maybe they can only get one of the Democrats to vote for it. Maybe they can't get either of the Democrats to vote for it. The Republicans, because they have 5 of the 7 members, they obviously have more than a majority of the members. In step 3, they can push forward a map still with just a simple majority of the commission members, but that map will only be in place for 4 years. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, why wouldn't they just zoom through to step 3 and just do a 4-year map? It's a great question. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. There's a couple of reasons why they might not want to do that. The first of which is that the governor, the auditor, and the secretary of state are all up for re-election next year in 2022. And so if they move forward and pass a 4-year map, by the time they have to come back to draw the map that would last the remaining 6 years of the decade, the governor, auditor, and secretary of state might be different people, and they might belong to different parties. And so if the Democrats pick up 2 of those 3 seats, they then would have 4 of the 7 commission member seats, and they then would control this process. So one piece of it is a balance of power issue. So you might have a different party who's in charge of this commission in year 5 for the redraw. The other piece of it is public pressure and accountability. Republicans and Democrats came out in 2015 and said, yes, we agree with Ohio voters. We want a fair process. We want bipartisan consensus for 10-year maps. And now it's our turn to actually hold them accountable to make sure that they do that. But still, they're able to pass a 4-year map. If they do, we just go to step 3A, which is on the bottom right side of this panel, which just says that in year 5, they come back together, they go through the whole process all over again, no matter where they land. So no matter if they get bipartisan support or not, that map is then in place for the remainder of the decade. So that's the state legislative process. It's the easier of the 2 processes. So I hope that wasn't too bad. I'm just going to pause here just for a quick beat to see if there's any questions about the process itself. Okay, I'm going to click us ahead then to talk about the new criteria that the state legislative maps have to meet. So in 2011, we had almost no criteria for what the maps had to look like, which is part of the reason why our maps are so gerrymandered. There was almost no guardrails keeping those lines intact and making sure that they were actually fair. So these are most of these are brand new rules that are a direct result of the 2015 reform measure. They are all now part of the Ohio Constitution. So every new state legislative map has to meet these criteria, no matter if it's a 10-year or a 4-year map. They've all got to meet these rules. The first rule is a fairly traditional redistricting rule. One is that the district lines, the boundaries have to be contiguous. That just means that there's one non-interrupted, non-intersecting line that makes up the border of the district. So what you don't want to have is a little piece of the district over here and then a totally separate island of the district over here. You want it to all be one area. The other is that the districts have to be compact. This usually isn't a problem for state legislative districts because the population size is pretty small. The other thing with compactness is that it's sort of a double-edged sword because compactness is also sometimes used as an excuse to pack voters of color together in districts. So just have to be wary of that. But the idea here is that you want to centralize where those districts are so that they are centralized around communities of interest and not sprawling to different parts of the state. The second criterion is that district boundaries should be used or should be created using existing county, city, and township boundaries. The idea here is that we want to try to keep communities together as much as possible. And where we can, we want to be using community boundaries that already exist to guide how we draw districts. In a similar vein, where possible, House districts should not split counties more than one time. The idea here is that we're trying to keep counties together, communities together as much as possible. If you look at our current district maps, they are very masterful at cracking apart communities, which is completely unnecessary for a state like Ohio because we are a state that is full of small and medium-sized counties, cities, townships that deserve to be included in their entirety within districts. So these are what these criteria, that's the idea that these criteria are trying to get at, is making sure that we're protecting communities against being cracked apart. The next criterion is about how big the districts are. And this goes to the heart of the constitutional promise of one person, one vote. The only way that we can ensure that people are proportionally represented is by drawing districts that are almost equally populated. And so this criterion just says that you can't have districts that vary more than 5% from either the biggest or the smallest district size. The next two criteria are my absolute favorite criteria. The first is that no district map should favor or disfavor one party over the other. That just means you cannot partisan gerrymander our state legislative maps. What does it mean to disfavor a political party? This is where the next criterion comes in. It's not just that there is a blanket ban on partisan gerrymandering. We go one step further, and this next criterion is actually unique to Ohio. We are the only state in the country that has this criterion. We require our future maps to have what's called representational fairness. And to explain this, I'm actually going to go back a couple of slides to these pie charts. So if you're looking over on the right-hand side, you see there's a huge difference between how we vote as Ohioans and who actually occupies the seats. And sorry, the idea of representational fairness is that if you are only winning 55% of the votes, you should also only be occupying about 55% of the seats. Similarly for the Democrats, if you're winning 45% of the votes, you should be occupying about 45% of the seats. If we had district maps that were actually representationally fair, you would not see such a discrepancy between how we vote and who actually wins those elections. And so this criterion is incredibly important to ensuring that our maps are actually representative of how we vote in Ohio. The final criterion is a traditional one in Ohio. It's just how we draw our districts. Every single Senate district in Ohio is just 3 connected House seats all nested together. So you just take 3 bordering House seats, draw one big line around them, and that's your Senate seat, which is why there's 33 Senate seats and 99 House seats. Let's see here. Where do independent voters figure into the criteria? Good question, Eleanor. The criteria actually require only looking at sort of like the 2 major parties who are represented. So you're looking at electoral data from the past decade to judge how Ohioans have voted for statewide, state and federal elections. And you're looking at general election results. The way that the Constitution is written is that you're looking at how the two major parties are represented. So unfortunately, there's not an explicit measurement for how independent voters factor into this. There's not a huge percentage of Ohio voters who are actually independent. Still, though, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be factored into how the districts are drawn, but the Constitution does not explicitly name them in terms of how we decide what the seat share should look like. Okay, so this is the state legislative process. I'm going to scoot us ahead in the interest of time to our congressional process. This is the more complicated of the two processes, so bear with me, but we'll get through it. You'll see a lot of similarities in this process to the state legislative one. There are bipartisan requirements for any 10-year map. You have to have both Republican and Democrat support for any 10-year map, just like you do with the state legislative process. There are also requirements for public hearings that have to happen after maps have been publicized, but before they get voted on. And you'll see a similar setup where there are multiple opportunities to get a bipartisan 10-year map and one final option to do a 4-year partisan map. There is one major difference in this congressional process, which I'll talk about in step 4, that makes it a little bit of a different strategy than the state legislative process, but let's dig in. And like I said a couple slides ago, the legislature is who's mostly in charge here, but still in step 2, you'll see the Redistricting Commission also plays a part. So in step 1, by September 30th, so remember the state legislative maps are due either September 1st or September 15th. And then 2 weeks later is the first congressional map due date, which means these two maps will be drawn at the same time. There will be negotiations about both of them happening, even if not out in public, undoubtedly behind closed doors, which we're going to fight against. But those conversations will happen at overlapping intervals. So in step 1, in order to get a 10-year congressional map, by September 30th, the legislature has to pass a map with at least 60% support in both chambers, including at least half of the Democratic caucuses. So half of the Senate Dems, half of the House Dems have to support that. If they can get all that done in their 2 public hearings that are required by September 30th, we're done in step 1, we've got a 10-year map. They can't do that, we go to step 2. The process then kicks out of the legislature and goes into the Redistricting Commission. So that 7-member commission who just finished drawing our state leg district comes into play. They then have 1 month until October 31st to get a bipartisan 10-year map. And then their rules apply. So again, they've got to get at least 2 Republicans, both of the Democrats to vote in favor of that map. If they can do that after they hold their hearings, then we're good to go. We have a 10-year map. If the commission can't do that, it goes back to the legislature for step 3, and the legislature gets 1 more shot at passing a 10-year map. In order to get a 10-year map in step 3, they again have to get at least 60% support from both chambers, but this time they only have to get 1/3 of the Democratic caucuses, which is not a lot of members. There's only 8 Democratic senators, for example. So they've only got 2 or 3 senators. They've got about 12 or 13 House members who they've got to get to support those maps step 3. If they can do that after their public hearings by November 30th, then we're good to go. We have a 10-year map. If they can't do that, we go to step 4, and step 4 is where there's a bit of a big difference. So here is where the 4-year map comes in. The legislature can just pass this with a simple legislative majority, which, like I said, the Republicans have, and then some, they've got super majorities in both chambers. That map, if they do pass that with no real Democratic support, would only be in place for 4 years. So maybe, again, you're thinking, well, why won't they just do a 4-year map? Here's the major kicker. First and foremost, in 4 years, when they come back in year 5, there will be new legislators in office, right? The legislative maps have been drawn by that commission. They will hopefully be much more fair. You could potentially have a Democratic majority in the House, not likely in the Senate, just given numbers. You could have it in the House, and so maybe you have different power dynamics, because what we, fingers crossed, will not see is supermajorities for Republicans in either chamber, and so they're going to have to actually work together with Democrats, gasp, to get those maps passed. So you might have different power dynamics in that last step. The other major stick that's hanging over their head to not pass a 4-year map is that there are additional stricter rules that apply to the map if it is passed for 4 years in step 4, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'll tell you right now, the Republicans are not going to want those extra strict rules on their maps. So they're probably going to try to avoid 4-year maps. Step 4A, which is on the bottom right panel here, just explains what happens if they do pass a 4-year map. They just come back in year 5, just like the state ledge process. They go through the whole thing again. If it doesn't matter where they stop in the process in year 5, whether they get bipartisan support or not, that map is then in place for the remainder of the decade. So that is the congressional process. I'm going to pause here to see if there are questions. Eleanor, to underscore again, it's about voting patterns. So, but it only takes into account the Democratic and Republican candidates. So they do not take into consideration, and they're for general elections. So there are rarely huge portions of the voting population who are supporting independent candidates in general elections. So it's just not part of the calculus.
Katie, I actually have 2 questions I want to hop
Sure.
in. They should be pretty simple, but I was just curious. So the Senate districts that are made up of 3 House districts,
Yeah.
is the proportional representation requirement, does that apply to the Senate districts as well? So they couldn't like gerrymander those with like a 2-1, 1-2 sort of thing?
So it's not necessarily about a district by district analysis. It's about the map overall. So you're not looking at, so what Chris is talking about is the I'm going to go back a couple slides. We're talking about the representational fairness criterion here for state legislative maps. Your analysis is statewide. So the way that you judge the representational fairness is by saying across the last decade, the way that Ohioans have voted in statewide, state and federal elections is a 55-45 split. That's not the exact number, but I'm just going to fill that in. It's about a 55-45 split. That said, the statewide proportion of Senate seats that are likely to be won by either Democrats or Republicans should closely reflect that 55-45 split. And so it's not necessarily a district by district analysis, it's a statewide analysis. So of all of the 99 House reps, about 55% of them should be Republicans, about 45% of them should be Democrats. Same thing with the Senate.
Cool. And then my second question is just real quick. What is the governor's role in the congressional map?
Good question. The only role that the governor has in the congressional map is in step 2. If it's the commission who actually adopts the congressional map, he's on that commission. So that's one role that he plays. But if it's passed by the legislature in either steps 1, 3, or 4, the legislature will pass that map just like they would any other bill. And so that bill then has to be signed into law by the governor. So the governor could veto the map that is passed by the legislature. I highly doubt that that would happen. I can't imagine that the Republican governor would not be on the same page as the Republican-led legislature, but wilder things have happened here in Ohio, so who knows? But he holds a veto pen if it's the legislature who passes the map, and he's a commissioner if it's the commission who passes the map in step 2. Bill asked a good question, which is where does the state Supreme Court fit into this map making process? So the Supreme Court, like I said, is the first stop in any litigation train related to the redistricting process. So if there is a challenge about the process itself, so say, for example, in this congressional process, they go to step 2 and they didn't actually hold 2 hearings before the legislature voted in step 1. You could go to the Supreme Court and say, excuse me, this process isn't right. They're breaking the rules. We want to challenge you. We want to have an injunction to make them hold those hearings. You go to the Ohio Supreme Court. If you're challenging the map itself, so once they pass the map, either out of the commission or the legislature, and you say, ooh, this map looks real gerrymandered, you go to the Ohio Supreme Court. They are the first people who get to judge that map. And if it is a partisan gerrymandering challenge, the only court who will ever judge that is the Ohio Supreme Court. So that's how they fit in. Okay, really quickly, I'm just gonna buzz us ahead to the criteria for our new congressional maps. These are all brand new. The only criteria that existed in 2011 for our congressional maps, I'm not kidding, there was literally one criteria, which was don't violate well, there were two criteria. One was don't violate the Ohio Constitution, and the second was don't violate any federal laws or the federal Constitution. That was it. Those were the only rules for our congressional maps, which maybe explains why they're so bad. Now we have all of these rules, which are good guardrails against the worst forms of gerrymandering. They could be better, but we'll talk about that. So the first one, similar to the state legislative maps, they've got to have contiguous borders. Again, that's one non-interrupted, non-intersecting line that makes up the border of the district. The other is that the districts are compact. This is, if you look at our current map, our congressional districts are really good at being huge, sprawling districts that bring together huge portions of the state that don't have a ton in common. So for example, Representative Jim Jordan's Duck District, the little tail goes almost all the way from the Indiana border. The belly of the duck hits into Dublin, a suburb of Columbus. The beak is all the way up by Lake Erie. That is an absolutely absurd district. Those parts of the state are very different and they do not belong in the same congressional district. So the idea here is that you are trying to centralize where those districts are located to protect communities of interest, to make sure that folks are in districts that make sense with other communities who have similar interests to their own. The next couple of criteria fit into the same umbrella that you saw with the state ledge maps, where there is a huge interest in trying to protect communities and to keep them together. The first set of rules is about how many counties we're allowed to split, if at all. Our current map of our 88 counties splits 55 of our counties into either 2, 3, or 4 congressional districts, which again is just not necessary. My favorite example always to bring up when I'm talking about this is Mercer County, which has a humble 30,000 person population and yet is split into 3 different congressional districts. That is absolutely ludicrous. There is no reason a county that small should have 3 different congressional representatives. So the new rules are that 65 of our 88 counties have to be kept whole. They cannot be split apart. 18 counties may be split once. 5 counties may be split twice. The reason I am really underscoring that may is because that is not a must. You do not need to split 18 counties once and 5 twice to draw a map. You can actually draw a congressional map that has as few as 7 or 8 county splits. And that's what you're trying to go for. You want to try to keep communities together as much as possible. The next set of rules is, what do we do with our major cities? Columbus is too big to fit into one congressional district, so we have to be split, but there are rules about splitting it responsibly to try to keep together as much of the urban core as possible, and not doing what our current Columbus anchor district does, which is keeps a little bit of the urban core together and then gets cracked apart by other Republican urban districts. Cleveland and Cincinnati cannot be split apart. They have to remain whole within their districts. This is vastly different than our current setup, where Cleveland is split into 4 congressional districts. Cincinnati is split in half into 2 different districts. Those 2 cities have to remain together in their entirety within a congressional district. The other major cities, Akron, Dayton, and Toledo, unfortunately, there are no rules requiring that they be kept together. They absolutely should be kept together. Those are not coincidentally major Democratic hubs, so they will be targets for being cracked apart and gerrymandered. So it will be the onus will be on us to make sure that they are not. We want to make sure that those places are kept together to not dilute the political power of the folks who live there. This last criteria is the last one that applies for any 10-year map, and that is that whoever is drawing the map, whether it's the legislature or the commission, has to attempt to include at least one entire county within every single congressional district. That obviously won't apply to Franklin County, for example, where Columbus inside Franklin County has to be split apart, or if doing so would violate federal law, for example, the Voting Rights Act. But the idea here, again, is trying to keep together communities as much as possible. This last bullet point on the page is the additional stricter rules that apply only to a 4-year map. It is only for 4-year maps that we see an explicit ban on partisan gerrymandering for congressional maps. That is different than the state legislative process, where there's just a blanket partisan gerrymandering ban, whether it's 10-year or a 4-year map. This is a huge this is one of the gaps in our reform measures, just to be honest, that we only have an explicit partisan gerrymandering ban on 4-year congressional maps. So technically, for steps 1 through 3, for a 10-year map, you could partisan gerrymander, and there's not a ton that we could do to enforce that in court. The second is that there are stricter rules against unnecessarily splitting apart counties, cities, and townships. So you see sort of a ratcheting up of the rules that I just talked about for 10-year maps. The third is that map drawers only have to attempt to draw compact districts rather than being required to do so like they are for a 10-year map. And then the fourth one seems like it doesn't really matter, but it's mostly important, especially for litigation afterwards. If the legislature passes a 4-year map, they have to include a written statement that explains how they met all of those additional criteria when drawing the map. And the reason that's so important is during the process itself, it's because we want to understand how legislators thought they did not partisan gerrymander, they kept communities together, they attempted to draw compact districts, and they couldn't even get a third of the Democrats to sign on to that map, right? So it's an accountability piece during the process itself, but also for potential litigation after the maps have been drawn, to be able to point to that in court and say, here are the reasons they claimed they had to draw the districts the way they did. Here's how that's not correct. So those are important criteria. I wish they were in effect for the entire process, but they're only in place for the 4-year map. So that's the end of the process itself. I will pause there for the rules on the congressional districts to see if there are questions about this. I don't see any. Oh, I see one that just popped in. What happens if there are lawsuits and they drag on to next November? A good question, Joseph. So if there are lawsuits, the courts are actually very good at making sure that they wrap them up importantly for the filing deadline for when candidates have to run under those new maps during the next election. So those actually happen in February of 2022. So that's actually the deadline for lawsuits, is getting that wrapped up. In rare instances, a court will push back a filing deadline. In even rarer cases, they will push back a primary election date. But the real sort of time crunch actually is on people who are filing the lawsuits, because they've got to get their arguments and their lawsuit together as quickly as possible to get into the court so that you can settle everything before those impending deadlines. And just to maybe answer a potential follow-up, if the Supreme Court happens to overturn a challenged map, it just goes back to whoever was in charge of drawing it. So the state ledge maps would go back to the commission, they would have to try again, or it would go back for the legislature for the congressional maps. And you hope that it gets wrapped up before the election. If it doesn't, which is often the case in redistricting cases because they take so long to get through, you could potentially have an election. You're not going to have an election under former maps, because then you would have a whole separate set of constitutional litigation over that. But that's how all that works out. One last thing that I'm gonna hype before I turn the mic back over is there are a number of public engagement opportunities that are really important for us to take advantage of. Some that are baked into the process itself, others that we will organize ourselves outside of the process. So before the process even starts, right now, I know Justin said that we're going to get started in September. I'm going to argue that our work has already begun organizing around redistricting. It is incredibly important, especially because we're getting our census data so late in the year, that we have an opportunity as Ohioans to inject our voices into this redistricting process. So if you are interested in town halls, stay tuned to All on the Line. You can go to allontheline.org. You can go down to the Ohio page and sign up to be a part of our list. But we are going to be hosting town halls across the state this summer, later in July and August, as a way to talk to people about this process, to talk about what's at stake for our communities with redistricting, and importantly, to talk to folks about how they can get engaged. One other thing that I will hype, which is not in this slide, is that our official redistricting process has not started at all. The governor has not convened our commission. The legislature broke for summer recess without any announced plans for when, first of all, when they're going to come back into session before redistricting, or scheduling any public hearings, which means that we don't have any way of telling when or if we will ever be able to engage in this process. If that bums you out as much as it bums me out, fear not. There is a separate process that is a grassroots, people-powered, independent commission. It's called the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission. Chris and I serve as commissioners on that commission. It is co-sponsored by the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, the Ohio chapter of the NAACP, and the A. Philip Randolph Institute in partnership with the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State. It is a great opportunity for folks to actually engage with a redistricting process since our official one has not kicked off. We host hearings across the state every second and fourth Thursday at 6 p.m. And I think Carrie, my colleague, has posted some links in the chat box. So if you are interested in joining us for those, please do. It's a great opportunity for us to actually get your voices heard before the official process starts up. During the process itself, there are requirements for hearings to be held after maps have been publicly proposed, but before they get voted on. The number of hearings that are required are not a lot. We will be pushing for many more hearings than this, but we're also preparing for getting the bare minimum and being able still to collect testimony. So we will also be hosting public testimony workshops this summer where folks can learn how best to write public comments and testimony about the redistricting process. OCRC is a great way to get practice doing that. So again, I would encourage you to go to those OCRC hearings. And then the other piece of it is publicly proposed maps, which is a great segue to our next conversation with the districtor training that Chris is going to lead. The Constitution allows Ohioans to propose their own maps to the official process for consideration, which is really, really important because you want to get as much public input into this process to show that there are other fair ways to draw districts other than by gerrymandering them or whatever bad maps are getting drawn behind closed doors. So this is an incredibly important opportunity for us to make sure that what our communities need is actually reflected in the process. So I'm going to close there and turn it over to Chris. This is a good segue to get into how you can get practice drawing your own maps.
Thank you, Katie. And it's always fun to hear you give that giant overview. I always feel, I've heard you do it a few times now, and I always feel like I learn something new every time. So thank you again for joining us. While I get my screen share set up, I'm going to launch our final poll question, which is kind of a test to see if people were listening. Who are the key decision makers in Ohio's redistricting process? So I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share going. All right. Can people see the District R website? We all good? All right. So Katie, while everyone's finishing out the poll, I'll queue up what we're going to be doing for the next 20 to 25 minutes or so. So Katie mentioned right there at the end that, you know, we are now just about a month away from when we get our redistricting data for Ohio. August 16th is the supposed date that will drop. And then Katie sketched out that timeline into the fall when the redistricting process is going to occur here in Ohio. And we should get public hearings. We should get these opportunities to engage, propose maps, talk about our communities, talk about all of the things that matter for what our maps should look like. And so fortunately, you do not need to wait for those public hearings to start your advocacy opportunities, or at least start getting practice and training around what you want to say and how you want to advocate for fair maps. And so I'm going to drop in the chat the link to this website, because I actually will encourage you to pull it up if you are on your computer and follow along with this tool and play around with it. Personally, but I'm kind of a nerd about these maps, is I find the map drawing process a lot of fun. And so we're going to talk about two different types of maps that you can draw using District R. The first one I'm going to just briefly show so that you know that it's possible to do with this tool, which is the district drawing map tool for if you want to draw districts. So I need to go back to the main page. So you know that this tool works. So this is not going to be our focus today, is you can actually draw a district map of Ohio and get practice doing this. Now, the data that is back dropping this district drawing tool isn't the final data, isn't the census data from 2020 yet. But if you have pulled up districtr.org/plan, we'll put this in the chat, this direct link. Where did the chat go? There it is. So that link brings you straight to this map of Ohio where you can actually start practicing painting district maps. And the reason why this is important is to know that, as Katie said, you can end up creating your own district maps to submit to the legislature in the end. And one of the things that I found a lot of fun that's important to do is all of those metrics that Katie sketched out. Start thinking through in your mind what it looks like for a map to not violate those rules. And because you can try and create a map that does its best that doesn't violate any of the constitutional rules, but then also takes into account some of the factors that maybe we should be thinking about that go beyond just the Constitution. So keeping communities together, not sending lines straight through an entire city or a community of interest, that sort of thing. So yes, most of you got it right that all of the above for the key decision makers in Ohio's redistricting process. It's the Senate, the House, and the Ohio Redistricting Commission, because we have both the congressional maps that are done by the legislature and then the state legislature maps that are done by the Ohio Redistricting Commission. So this tool, real quick, just so you know how this tool works, and the two tools we'll be showcasing today are fairly similar, but if you want to start drawing districts, you've got 16 different colors. You select your color and you can just start drawing your maps. So for instance, let's say you wanted to have a district that is based with Athens as its core district. You can just paint that county, and then you could start painting the counties around it based on what you think like a Southeast Ohio district would look like. And over here on the right side, it shows you what an ideal district size is going to be for Ohio, because we have 15 districts now. The ideal district size is going to be roughly 769,000 people. And so as you paint these counties, that map, the population for that district is going to fill up, and you can get it right to that line of about 769,000. And so then you can try and draw other maps, but that's the important thing to note, is that you can fill up an entire map and an entire district, entire map with 15 districts and hit those constitutional rules. So noting that that tool is here, but we are actually going to focus on a different tool, which is drawing community maps. So if you go back to the first link that I dropped, which is for drawing community maps through the Open Ohio Public Engagement in Neighborhoods Mapping Project. As Katie mentioned, the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission is partnering with the Ohio State University's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and Tufts University MGG Redistricting Lab. They are calling for people all across Ohio to create what are called community maps. And what I'm going to do is illustrate how this type of tool can be used to describe a community and illustrate the important factors about that community. And then we'll also briefly talk about how that can play into the redistricting process itself. But I'm not going to ask the questions. I'm going to kick it over to Kalia now, my colleague, who will be asking me the questions as I draw the map and talk through these things.
Great, thanks, Chris. My name is Kalia Tellez. I'm the Environmental Policy Fellow at the Ohio Environmental Council. And as we know, districts that split communities in half or in multiple parts dilutes the voting power and representation. It erases critical voices, as Justin and all of us have hit upon, the people most impacted by environmental issues, Black, Brown, Indigenous folk, are most often excluded by the political process. So this map making is the opportunity to add your voice to the redistricting process. It's the opportunity for districts to not only be intentionally place-based, but people-based. So what would it look like for Ohio's districts to be centered on the lived experiences of Ohioans? For leaders to be accessible to all their constituents and to uplift the narratives, the organizing in your communities. So Chris, let's get started and share your personal narrative of your community. And with this tutorial, and I hope you'll all follow along or make your map shortly after this, but we're gonna explore the assets, needs, interactions in your community, and we'll start to piece out what's at stake with fair maps. So understanding that our lives live without clear borders, can you define your area geographically? So what are the borders or boundaries of your community?
Yeah, so I live very close to Ohio State here in Columbus. And what the map that I'm going to be drawing, this community that I'm going to be drawing, is I'm calling the essentially like the Ohio State / post-Ohio State community. And this is essentially a community, a residential community that is, Ohio State is right at its center. It's because that's smack dab along the Olentangy River between 315 and 71. But then it is a residential area that kind of extends a little bit west of the campus, a little bit to the south of the campus, roughly around, I would say probably King Avenue or Fifth Avenue. It spreads eastward roughly to about, there's railroad tracks that run straight up here just to the west of 71 and up into the Old North Columbus area. And its northern border is roughly around, is roughly this. And so what we have here is an OSU map that, a map of the OSU area where you've got people who either live and go to Ohio State. There's a lot of college students that live in this area, but there's also a lot of people who are either recently college grads and just still live in this area because it's what's affordable or it's where they're used to living, or just happen to like the area. There are some permanent residents, but it is a lot of renters. I know at least a few college professors like live right here in the permanent space right around Ohio State. But it's roughly bordered by 5 distinct communities that kind of buttress in this this area. So we have Grandview Heights right to its south. To its west, we have Upper Arlington, and both of those communities are very affluent suburbs of Columbus. To the north of this campus area, we have Clintonville, which I know Katie knows a lot about Clintonville. And then to the south of the campus area, we have Victorian Village, Short North, which are much higher priced communities with a lot of, but also a lot of restaurants and bars and areas that people who live in this area might go down to. But usually it's a little bit more expensive to live down there. There's also a lot more permanent residents, people who live houses, especially own houses, especially in the Victorian Village area. And then you get further south into actual downtown Columbus. And then to the east, you have Linden, which is a predominantly Black community in Columbus. And you'll notice that 71 and these railroad tracks cause a very distinct boundary between these communities.
So it's important what Chris is doing. He is not only marking the physical aspects of his map, but he's verbally sharing this narrative about who lives in this community. Where do people travel? Where do people not travel? That railroad is a pretty harsh line between Linden and Clintonville and Old North, for example. But what you would do is you could share that narrative in that description box where it says describe your community. This can be in bullet points. This can be in paragraphs, however you want to just bring your map to life a little bit. So Chris, can you showcase the important places tool and then maybe just verbally give us some of the examples of the important places that you would mark?
Yeah, so on this map, so the things that I'm going to highlight are some of the really important resources that exist throughout this community. So in particular, this is actually a very well-resourced community when it comes to grocery stores, which is not necessarily the case for all of Columbus. So up on the north end of the community, we have, there's a giant eagle right here. On the south end, there's a Kroger down at, where is King? Right here. Yeah, right there, there's a Kroger. Over on the west side, there is also another Kroger over here. And this is important just to emphasize that this community has 3 grocery stores around it, which is not necessarily true for every community. There's also a lot of things to do in this area throughout the community. So there's lots of shopping and restaurants and bars all along High Street. There's the Gateway Film Center, which is right around here. And we've got, obviously there's everything that has to do at Ohio State. You've got the football stadium, you've got the Schottenstein Center, which is a huge sport and music venue for big artists that come in. You've also got smaller theaters that are in the Grandview area, even though not directly right in the community, and also a theater that's up in Indianola, on Indianola Avenue, leading up into Clintonville. So there's a lot of entertainment opportunities. I think it's worth noting too, though, that this community is also experiencing high levels of development right now. Lots of new apartment high rises going in, and that's really impacting the pricing. A lot of people who used to live here because it was more affordable still had like the college housing pricing. Some of those prices are starting to price people out of being able to live in this area, and so it's also worth noting the thing you can do with the important places tool, noting the Olentangy River, which is a huge source of recreation for people who live along the river, and there's other green space as well, including
that's a good
good segue,
transition point. You know, as we think about these important places, we begin to identify some of the key assets of your community. So think about the environmental assets like green space, as Chris was saying, but also think about access to public transportation. Where do you access fresh air, clean water, public lands? You know, do you have access to a bike path? Things like that. So can you touch on some of those examples, Chris?
Yeah, so I used to live in the Old North part of this. And so one of the reasons why I've chosen this community is I've lived here roughly for 10 years now. I went to Ohio State and lived on campus for 1 year, and then I lived in the Old North area for a good chunk of that. And then for the past few years, I've lived over on the west side of the river. And all of these areas have a similar thing, which is a relationship to the campus. I actually was really surprised when I moved over to this west side of this community on the other side of the river. There's actually still a big chunk of students that live here. And there's a lot of transportation corridors for everyone that lives in this community. There's bus lines that go from these portions toward Ohio State. All of the bus routes are kind of headed in toward Ohio State. There's bike lanes on a lot of the roads, especially going north-south along Summit and 4th, there are bike lanes. And then there's also the bike trail itself that runs along the river and creates this green space. And there's wetlands as well, giving a really unique nature experience for people who live in this area all along the river. And it creates for a very surprisingly amount of green space in what is primarily an urban area of Columbus.
Yeah, thanks for identifying some of those assets. Can you identify needs, you know, or environmental or health hazards in your community? And through this, maybe this can start a conversation on envisioning a future for your community.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really important to highlight that a lot of the students cared about over the past few years was that there is now a natural gas plant being built on the west side of Ohio State's campus. So a lot of students were really concerned about that. It's being built over on this area. So that's significant when people are thinking about climate change and those sorts of impacts. There's also a lot of construction always going on in this area, which can create some air pollution issues as well. Ohio State is always building things. There's the hospital right there, but they're always building things at the hospital. I think it's always interesting to think. I can't remember a time where they haven't been building something while I've been living in this area. Other things I would say, with the younger student population, there's a lot of really a lot of interest and scrutiny especially over the past year in relationships between police and the community, and so that's also an issue that a lot of people are caring about in this community, and also just in general, the university plays a huge role in everything that happens in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. This last question, it's a little more broad, but let's talk about what's at stake in your community with redistricting. And the way I like to think about it is what would I like to know, my representative, to know about my community? And I actually live very close to Chris. And as he mentioned, that gas plant, it's like a couple blocks from where we live, but it's in a completely different district because of the gerrymandering in this area. And that sort of relates to the overall greenlining, because I consider this my community too. And actually, as Chris pointed out in the other map, you can use that demographics tool on this map too. And that can show just how green-lined this area is with green spaces in predominantly white areas, white affluent areas. So, I would want my district representative to understand that, access to green space in Columbus is a privilege, and people do travel far in and out of what may be considered their immediate communities to meet their needs as humans, as a community. So Chris, do you have any final reflections on what's at stake in your community with redistricting?
Yeah, one of the things that I would say it's really important, and I want to answer, taking this opportunity to answer Stephen's question in the Q&A, which is there a certain size to these communities? Say one city is 35K, would that be a community? So these communities are very, in a sense, there are like definitions to these communities. Like, this is very clearly like the campus area, but each community is going to be a little bit different. And in some instances, almost personal to your experience of your community. Someone else drawing this campus area map because of their experiences and perceptions might define it a little bit differently, but there is not a set size for these communities. It's really all dependent on the circumstances. Someone who lives in a rural area, for instance, so my parents live up in Morrow County, they may draw a map that is all of Morrow County because in Morrow County, you got to go to a lot of different towns to get resources. They don't have a grocery store where they live. The closest grocery store is 15 to 20 minutes away from them. So the entire county may be their community. But here for me, it's this kind of contained area. And you asked like what's at stake for representation. Now, for congressional representation, usually I believe this community has actually been picked apart a little bit. A big chunk of this district is in the current district that is represented by Joyce Beatty, but there's actually a chunk of this that has had a congressional district dive almost all the way down to Lane Avenue through Clintonville. It's a good example of gerrymandering where you have this district that dives all the way into the city and scoops up a section of voters. And in the state legislative maps, this area is actually kind of the confluence of 3 different state legislative districts. And so I think one of the things to be thinking about why these community maps are so important is that, at least in my mind, this campus community should probably be represented by the same person, whether it's for state legislatures or for Congress. And so similarly, thinking about any of the communities that other people might draw that are around this community, having those distinct lines and those distinct narratives about these communities is what informs the redistricting process. You draw this community map, and I could hypothetically go to the state legislature in a few months and say, hey, this is my community, don't put a line through it. And that's the importance. And you say, why this is my community? Here's the shared experiences of the people that live in this community. And so real quick, before we take 7 minutes to kind of open it up for any general questions that you might have for the entire day, I want to highlight what you do with this map now. If you have been pulling the website up, what you're going to want to do is click this save button on the right if you're drawing your own map, or if you do this later. And then when you save it, this little portal shows up that says proceed to submit map. And this is actually your opportunity to do what Katie mentioned, which was the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission you can actually submit the map directly to the commission and provide information about it and share your thoughts on it and participate in that process. But then also save your map, save that information, save that narrative, and then consider using it in the actual formal process in a few months as well. So that's all I have. Kalia, do you have any final thoughts to bring up?
No, that's all. Thank you so much for sharing your community with us.
Yeah, and I plan on filling out all this information, describing the community more fully, and naming these points. We didn't have the time to do that all in one go, but this is going to be one of the most detailed community maps I've drawn so far. So I'm excited to flush it out at the end. We've got 6 minutes, so if people have any final questions about this process, please drop them in the chat now. But Justin and Katie, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this community map making process, especially Katie. I know you have thoughts living in the community just north of me.
Yeah, well, I was joking with Carrie in the office that your borders are creeping a little bit into Clintonville. You are a little above Old North, but no, I just wanted to underscore why this process is actually so important. First, asking folks to draw whole district plans is a lot. There are not a ton of, I mean, I'm literally paid to work in this space and I don't want to draw maps, whole district plans. So I'm not a nerd like that, like Chris is, but these community plans are much more sort of reachable for folks because all we're asking is for your own expertise about what your own lived experiences are in your neighborhood, in your community. And it's a way for you to completely dictate the conversation about where your community is. How has it changed in the last 10 years? Are there communities next to yours that it would make sense to include in a district? Are there places where it would be okay to split them apart? The lines have to go somewhere. So of course we have to divide the state up into districts, but where we do so should be centered on where people actually live and how we're defining our communities. So this tool I just think is so helpful to do that. And if you want to draw whole district plans, more power to you, but these community maps are a good way to sort of dive into the redistricting pool.
And I'm going to respond to Chantal's comment in the chat. I realized I had been posting the links to just the panelists and not panelists and attendees. So here's the link to where you can draw a community map directly. And then if you are interested in trying your hand at drawing an actual district map as well, then here is the link for that. Should be,
yeah.
That.
And I mean, in addition to that, I think, the final thing I just want to leave people with too is, from my perspective, as I told you, I live in Washington, D.C., and I really want people to understand the opportunity that you have in order to really focus your maps, focus who represents you in Congress, because I live in Washington, D.C., which is a place where we have no congressional representation. We have no Senate representation. And so, it really is a gift and a privilege to be able to participate in democracy like this. And so, I'm trying to do all the work in here in order to make sure you all have that right. But understand that there are folks throughout the country that actually don't have this right. And we're working on that in DC, which is a whole nother webinar that I'd be more than happy to talk to you about with DC statehood. But, this really is a great opportunity that not everybody has. And so we really want all of you to take this seriously and as much as you can in order to really inform our elected officials of what is really important in representation in our communities and being a part of that. So once again, thank you all for doing this, and really looking forward to seeing what comes out of this process.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Katie and Kalia, for joining us. And I hope people have found this informative. We're at 4:28, so I want to make sure those of you who are here for CLE credit know when this Zoom ends, you will be prompted with a survey to answer the survey questions. There will be a slot to put in your attorney CLE number. That'll be the way to make sure we get credit from you. But also, if you've been tuning in and you've been answering the poll question, that's also tracking. But please fill out that survey so we can make sure that you all get credit for tuning in. And If anyone has any final closing thoughts, now would be the time to share them. But otherwise, I think we are good.